What happened when an undercover CEO discovered the quiet struggles of his overlooked staff at a remote mountaintop observatory? You're about to hear a story that redefines leadership, compassion, and accountability. Welcome, insightful and caring listeners. You've chosen the perfect place to be today. In this powerful narrative, a CEO trades his title for a maintenance badge and flashlight, only to uncover exhaustion, silence, and quiet resilience among his team. What starts as an experiment becomes a life-changing mission. Get ready for a story that will move your heart and remind you of the power of truly seeing one another. Dr. Adrian Wells stood alone in the top-floor boardroom of Novascope Observatory, the hum of the heating system barely audible beneath the silence. The digital dashboards behind him glowed with charts and metrics, grant wins, telescope uptime, research citations, all proudly displaying that the observatory was thriving. But Adrian's gut told a different story. Over the past few months, he'd received a series of emails, some anonymous, some hastily signed by junior technicians and lab assistants, quietly raising red flags. Reports of burnt-out staff, broken heating units left unrepaired through winter, missed breaks, and grieving researchers being left unsupported had started to form a mosaic of neglect. Most haunting of all was a note scribbled in a margin: "It's easier to be invisible than expendable." He brought it up in the last executive meeting, but the response was predictable. His deputy, Marcus Lynn, called it emotional noise, and another board member joked that scientists just need thicker skin. Adrian didn't laugh. He remembered the observatory's early days when it was still just one telescope, 5 scientists, and a shared dream of bringing the universe closer to Earth. It used to be about passion, collaboration, and curiosity. Now it felt like metrics, funding races, and unchecked detachment. Town halls yielded nothing but rehearsed politeness. Employee surveys came back oddly positive, clearly filtered. Adrian wanted to believe the culture he'd nurtured was still alive somewhere in the shadows of his institution, but he could no longer trust filtered data or secondhand reports. If he truly wanted to find the cracks, he needed to descend from the top floor. That evening he made the decision: no public announcements, no staged walkarounds. He would become Alan, a night support technician on probation, assigned to the maintenance crew that kept the facility clean, heated, and running after dark. No clipboard, no CEO title, just a jumpsuit, a name tag, and the truth. The wind bit harder than Adrian expected as he stepped onto the gravel access road leading up to the staff entrance of Novascope Observatory. The mountain ridge was quiet under a cloud-covered sky, the domes of the telescopes silhouetted against the pale stars barely peeking through. Dressed in a bulky maintenance uniform and thick gloves, Adrian, now Alan, approached the door with a badge labeled Temp Staff. Inside, the observatory hummed with quiet energy: distant fan motors, the soft whir of servos adjusting instruments, and the muffled murmur of late-night researchers speaking into headsets. He was greeted not by a manager, but by Elsie, a slim, sharp-eyed janitorial crew lead who barely looked up from her clipboard. "Alan, right? You've got the level 2 labs tonight. Avoid the cleanroom corridor. They're hypersensitive about dust." She handed him a supply cart with a weak wheel and walked off without waiting for confirmation. As the shift unfolded, Adrian moved through dim hallways and utility stairwells he'd never paid attention to before. The observatory looked different from this angle. No gleaming PR videos, just damp floor mats, leaky pipes, and cluttered break rooms. In Lab B, he passed a young technician nodding off at her workstation, an empty energy drink can beside her. In the data center, a lone IT staffer sat hunched over blinking servers, rubbing his temples with visible strain. When Adrian tried to make small talk, most people nodded politely and moved on, clearly too exhausted or too wary to engage. What struck him most, however, was the silence, not from the lack of conversation, but from the weight of unseen labor. Empty coffee pots refilled without thanks, hallway spills mopped up in ghost shifts, broken chairs replaced with mismatched ones from storage. No recognition, no acknowledgement, just invisible effort, sustaining a prestigious machine. As he scrubbed a handprint off a control room window, Adrian caught his own reflection. Eyes tired, posture hunched. For the first time, he saw the building not as a marvel of innovation, but as a tower propped up by people nobody noticed. And that first night, under fluorescent lights and dust-streaked panels, the gap between leadership and lived experience felt wider than any telescope's view of the stars. On his third night on the ridge, Adrian, still hidden behind the alias Alan, began to feel the pulse of the observatory's unspoken tension. What looked orderly on paper revealed cracks under pressure. The telescope rotation logs were behind, the cafeteria had cut back on more meals during night shifts, and nearly every staff member he passed moved like they were walking underwater, slow, tired, automatic. In Dome 3, where the latest deep space lens had just been installed, he overheard a quiet argument between two lab assistants. "We're already 3 days behind on calibration," one whispered, glancing nervously toward the corridor. "And Elise hasn't submitted the last report." The other muttered, "Because she hasn't slept more than 4 hours in a week." It was Elise Kwan they were talking about, a senior astronomer and one of the most respected minds on the ridge. Adrian had noticed her before, always moving quickly, face tight with focus. But that night, he found her alone in the mechanical storage wing, sitting beside a console with her head in her hands. For a moment, she looked like someone trying to hold the sky together. Adrian didn't speak, just kept cleaning nearby, unsure if acknowledging her would help or humiliate. Eventually, Elise stood, wiped her face, and disappeared down the corridor. Later, while changing the air filters in the ventilation room, Adrian ran into Marco, the overnight maintenance tech with a limp and a toolbox that rattled like a maraca. Between grim jokes and wheezes, Marco mentioned how the dome mechanisms were overdue for servicing. "Budget got slashed again," he said, tightening a bolt with visible effort. "They keep expecting miracles on duct tape and unpaid overtime." The more Adrian observed, the more the observatory felt like a pressure cooker. Data delays, overworked teams, and administrators that responded with silence or shrugs. It wasn't incompetence, it was exhaustion institutionalized. The cracks weren't in the dome, they were in the people holding it up. And the silence at the top only made them wider. By the time Adrian clocked out and stepped into the icy night, he realized the stars weren't the only things out of reach here. Recognition, rest, and respect were even farther, and he wasn't sure how long the staff could keep orbiting without burning out. It happened on a bone-cold Thursday night, the kind that made the wind whistle through the steel beams of the ridge. Adrian, still moving through the observatory in his janitor's uniform, was assigned to check the lower lab corridors and restock sanitization supplies. Halfway through his rounds, he passed the data relay hub and noticed something off. The normally humming servers were quiet, lights blinking in erratic patterns. Inside, slumped over a console, was Elise Kwan. At first, Adrian thought she had just fallen asleep, but when he gently knocked on the glass and she didn't move, panic bloomed in his chest. He pushed the door open, rushed to her side, and saw her pale, clammy skin and shallow breathing. "Elise," he called, shaking her shoulder. She stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent. Adrian didn't wait, he radioed dispatch, requesting medical support. "Protocol says to notify admin first," the operator replied. "Do you want me to log this or not?" Adrian's voice tightened. "She needs help now. Log it later." It took another 8 minutes for someone from the health station to arrive. In that time, Elise drifted in and out of consciousness, clutching her side and muttering equations like they were lifelines. When the med team finally came, they loaded her onto a stretcher with robotic comm. "Dehydration, burnout," one technician said, checking her vitals. "She's lucky someone found her." Adrian followed them out into the hallway, heart pounding. As they turned the corner, he overheard another staffer whisper, "That's the second one this month." That hit like a gut punch. Later, alone in the break room, Adrian saw the posted schedules. Elise had been working 12-hour nights for the past 3 weeks without a single day off. No wonder she collapsed. What haunted him more was how unsurprised everyone seemed. The observatory's silence wasn't just in the dome. It was in the way people ignored pain until it exploded. Elise's collapse wasn't a freak incident. It was the system's inevitable byproduct. And for the first time since arriving, Adrian felt something beyond observation rise in him. A quiet rage. If the stars were the goal, what good was reaching them when the people guiding the way were falling apart? Something had to give, and he was done pretending this wasn't his problem to solve. The morning after Elise's collapse, Adrian returned to the observatory earlier than usual. The frost on the glass dome had barely begun to melt, and the ridge was cloaked in an eerie hush. He moved through the halls, unnoticed, no longer just observing, but searching, digging beneath the surface. What he found was worse than he'd expected. The official logs listed Elise as on rest leave due to fatigue, but there was no mention of how long she'd gone without a break, no note of the dangerous hours she'd been pulling. It was as if her near concussion had already been swept into a data column, sanitized. In the maintenance office, Adrian sat across from Ravi, a systems technician with calloused hands and dark circles under his eyes. "She's not the first," Ravi said without needing to hear Adrian's question. 3 others left in the last 6 months. Burnout, stress, one even broke down during a calibration test. HR buried it, called it personal matters. His voice was low, bitter. "We're not astronomers up here anymore. We're maintenance tools for funding reports." Later, Adrian checked the break schedules and discovered a clear pattern: strategic understaffing. Departments were stretched just enough to function, but never enough to breathe. Bonuses were issued for staying under budget, which meant supervisors pushed overtime, quietly discouraged sick leave, and turned a blind eye to exhaustion. Even safety inspections had been skipped. He found a maintenance report marked urgent from weeks ago, still unresolved, warning that one of the auxiliary coolant systems was close to failure. By midday, Adrian found himself standing alone beneath the dome, staring at the telescope's gleaming frame. The beauty of the cosmos stretched overhead, but below it, the human foundation was crumbling. They were reaching for distant galaxies while ignoring the people doing the reaching. It was a metaphor he couldn't escape. He thought about Elise, how she whispered equations as if they were prayers, the way she refused help until her body gave out. How many more were like her? How long had this system relied on silent suffering to keep running? The stars no longer felt like a frontier, they felt like a distraction. And for Adrian, that changed everything. If the observatory was to find its way again, someone had to bring the buried light back to the surface. Though he just hadn't expected it would be him. It happened during the weekly staff check-in, a half-hearted gathering held over lukewarm coffee in the observatory's common room, where most simply nodded through updates while their minds remained on data logs and unfinished tasks. But this time, Adrian, still wearing his alias as Alan, stood a little straighter, his heart thudding in his chest. He watched Elise enter, slower than usual but upright, her movements more guarded. Ravi was at her side, clearly watchful. Adrian knew it was time. The disguise had served its purpose, but continuing the charade felt dishonest now, especially after seeing what this place had cost them. He cleared his throat. "There's something I need to tell you all," he began, his voice firm but not loud. A few heads turned, mildly curious. Elise looked up briefly, then back at her tea. "My name's not Alan. I'm Adrian Wells. I'm the founder and CEO of NovaReach." For a long second, no one reacted. Then Ravi's eyebrows shot up. A technician dropped their pen. Elise froze, cup halfway to her mouth. "I came here undercover to understand what was really happening on this ridge," Adrian continued. "What I saw changed me." There was a tension in the air, brittle and uncertain. Elise finally spoke. "Why didn't you just ask us?" she said, her voice sharper than he'd ever heard it. "Why sneak around, pretending to be one of us?" Adrian didn't flinch. "Because I've been asking for years, and I kept getting polished answers, reports that never mentioned what I saw in your eyes. I needed to feel it, to earn your honesty, and I did." Someone muttered, "Well, you've got it now." Adrian stepped forward, voice softer. "I saw the burnout, the skipped inspections, the grief you've carried without pause, Elise. You deserved better, and I let this place fail you." He looked around the room. "Starting today, that ends. Every report will be re-reviewed. Safety protocols will be restructured, and this team will be given the resources and rest it should have had all along." The silence that followed wasn't angry, it was stunned, and in that silence, Adrian saw it. The moment trust started to flicker back to life. Not fully, not yet, but enough to start over, this time with truth. The days that followed Adrian's revelation were unlike anything the observatory had experienced in years. Word spread quickly, both at the Ridge and back at NovaReach headquarters. The staff, still reeling from the CEO's sudden unmasking, approached each new shift with a mix of curiosity, hope, and lingering skepticism. But Adrian was there for every meeting, every briefing, no longer as Alan the janitor, but as Adrian Wells, the founder who had finally come back down to earth to lift his people up. He brought engineers from headquarters to evaluate the failing dome infrastructure, halted all pending data reports to focus entirely on staff safety and wellness, and held one-on-one conversations with every employee, from telescope operators to cleaning staff. The most visible change came within a week. The crumbling dormitory wing, long neglected due to budget reallocations, was scheduled for immediate renovation. No more leaking pipes, no more faulty heaters. A temporary housing unit was set up, stocked with clean linens and actual mattresses, not the cots that had become the norm. Elise was offered extended paid leave with mental health support, a move that stunned her into silence. When she declined the time off, saying she didn't want to abandon her team, Adrian countered by hiring 2 new full-time researchers and bringing back a former colleague Elise had mentored years ago. Even the little things shifted. Fresh meals replaced vending machine dinners, equipment upgrades were ordered, not just for scientific work, but for the maintenance team who had been patching this place together with duct tape and goodwill. Adrian made it clear leadership would now rotate in and out of the observatory regularly, not just visit twice a year, and no one, absolutely no one, would be working 16-hour shifts ever again. There were murmurs of disbelief, of course. Change had been promised before, but this time it felt different. Adrian was hauling trash with Ravi one afternoon and sitting in on night observation logs with Elise the next. He wasn't above the work. He was inside it, shoulder to shoulder with the very people his decisions once burdened. Reform wasn't a memo anymore. It was a mop, a screwdriver, a shared meal, and a genuine apology. At 9,000 feet above sea level, trust began to rise again, not as a sudden gust, but as a steady wind. And for the first time in far too long, the mountaintop observatory didn't just feel like a workplace. It felt like a home. The restoration of the observatory's mission began not with a groundbreaking discovery, but with a quiet night beneath clear skies, when, for the first time in weeks, the dome turned smoothly without groaning. Elise stood at the main console, her fingers dancing over the controls as she guided the telescope toward a distant galaxy. Adrian sat beside her, not as a supervisor, but as a student, watching, listening, learning. The hum of well-maintained machinery filled the control room, and for once the silence wasn't born of exhaustion but of focus. Outside, Ravi inspected the newly installed secondary generator with a grin of disbelief, finally able to trust that the lights would stay on through a storm. Carmen organized the data logs with the ease of someone who no longer had to shoulder an entire department alone. Even late arrivals from headquarters were met with welcoming nods instead of wary glances. The observatory, once fraying at the seams, had begun to breathe again. But the most profound shift wasn't physical, it was emotional. Elise, still healing, had begun mentoring a new graduate assistant, passing on both knowledge and cautionary wisdom. Ravi started a maintenance logbook, not because he had to, but because he finally had time. The crew's morning coffee meetings, once rushed and muttered, turned into real conversations, with ideas shared freely and without fear. Adrian made sure every department had a voice in the upcoming operational review, implementing a standing rule. No one makes decisions about the mountain without input from the mountain. One evening, as the team gathered outside to observe a meteor shower, Adrian brought out a telescope he used decades ago, the one he'd nearly sold to fund the company's first year. "We started with this," he said softly. "One lens, one dream. But we lost sight of what mattered." Elise looked at him, then at the others, and nodded. "Now we're finding it again." Above them, streaks of silver carved across the night sky. In that moment, under the dome of stars they'd once feared collapsing, the team stood shoulder to shoulder, not as subordinates or executives, but as explorers. The observatory had found its light again, and this time it wasn't just starlight. It was human, it was shared, and it was here to stay. Weeks after Adrian's reveal and the sweeping changes that followed, the observatory on the ridge began to feel like a different place, not just in operations but in spirit. The air, once thick with tension and fatigue, now held an undercurrent of quiet optimism. Employees who had once clocked in with heads down now entered the dome with a renewed sense of purpose. Elise, no longer isolated by grief, found herself surrounded by a support network she hadn't expected, technicians checking in without being asked, graduate assistants staying late to help catalog data, and even Ravi dropping by with fresh brewed coffee and a sarcastic joke or two. The culture of silence that had once dominated the ridge was giving way to something else, a culture of listening, of participation, of belonging. Adrian made it a point to spend half his time out of the executive office and inside the labs, the control room, or even walking the perimeter of the facility during shift changes. He asked questions, not the kind designed to audit or intimidate, but ones that signaled curiosity and care. What do you need more of? What's one thing that would make your job easier? And the staff slowly at first began to answer. Suggestions turned into policies, concerns turned into action. Bit by bit, trust was being rebuilt. The observatory's data output had increased, but that wasn't what Adrian took the most pride in. It was the way people lingered after shifts to look through telescopes together, pointing out constellations, or how laughter occasionally echoed through the halls late at night. It was how Elise now spoke in team meetings, not cautiously, but confidently, sharing ideas for improving long-term research timelines, or how Carmen, once buried in solo tasks, now led a committee focused on sustainability and staff well-being. Even the quietest among them, like the part-time meteorologist Marcus, had started sharing weather insights in weekly roundups, sparking lively discussions. One night, during a rare all-hands stargazing session, Adrian stood beside Elise as a comet passed overhead. "We've all been looking down for so long," she murmured, "but now, we're looking up again." Adrian nodded, the cold wind brushing against his face, and replied, "And we're doing it together." Above them, the sky stretched wide and luminous, and below, the people who once worked in silence now stood shoulder to shoulder, not just seeing the stars, but belonging among them. Months after the reform initiatives took root at the ridge, a new energy pulsed through the observatory, subtle yet unmistakable, like the hum of the dome just before it opens to the sky. What had once been a place of overwork and resignation now resembled a living constellation of talent, compassion, and shared purpose. The staff had not only adapted to the changes, but begun shaping them. Elise, now officially promoted to Deputy Director of Scientific Programs, had introduced mentorship cycles connecting junior researchers with senior astronomers. Ravi was spearheading a mental health initiative, complete with anonymous check-ins and bi-weekly group sessions. Carmen, ever the quiet anchor of the night shift, led a team that reimagined maintenance protocols based on feedback from every department, not just engineering. Everyone, from meteorologists to janitorial staff, had become part of a larger, more responsive system. Adrian, no longer undercover but no less attentive, chose to remain visible. He didn't just pop in during crises or photo ops. He joined safety drills, stayed late during meteor showers, and continued to ask hard questions with soft eyes. He also launched a monthly town hall under the stars where everyone could speak freely, their voices rising with the wind, untethered by hierarchy. The first session drew skepticism. By the third, there weren't enough chairs. The observatory's external metrics improved, better data consistency, higher publication rates, and a drop in staff turnover, but it was the internal alignment that mattered most. People no longer felt replaceable. They felt seen, valued, heard. During a winter celebration held beneath the dome, Adrian unveiled a new mural in the central corridor, a sweeping depiction of constellations reimagined as staff members, each with a story, each with a light of their own. At the center, a stylized telescope aimed skyward, surrounded by hand-drawn initials representing every team member who'd contributed to the rebuild. He called it the new constellation. That night, Elise stood beside Adrian again and said quietly, "This place isn't just functioning, it's becoming." Adrian looked around at the smiling faces, at the way people leaned into each other, and at the glint of stars peeking through the open dome. "We didn't fix a building," he said. "We lit a whole system back up. The ridge would never be what it once was. But in that, it had become something better. Something built not just on science, but on humanity. A constellation, drawn from the ground up." The story of Adrian Wells and the Mountaintop Observatory teaches a profound lesson. Leadership is not about titles or distance, It's about presence, empathy, and action. For years, Adrian ran the ridge from afar, trusting reports and protocols to maintain order. But when he stepped into the world of his staff, into their fatigue, their silence, and their quiet resilience, he discovered a truth buried beneath polished data. Systems built without compassion eventually collapse under their own weight. By removing his CEO mask and becoming part of the team, Adrian uncovered not just inefficiencies, but humanity. The true brilliance of the observatory didn't lie in its equipment or research. It lived in the people who kept it breathing, often unseen and unheard. Through listening, validating pain, and acting with humility, Adrian transformed a broken system into a community fueled by mutual respect and purpose. The Ridge reminds us that reform doesn't start in a boardroom. It begins when leaders are brave enough to ask, "What don't I see?" and stay long enough to hear the answer. Lasting change requires not just policies, but presence. And when dignity becomes part of the blueprint, even the coldest institution can rediscover its light.